to continue things there, just thank you again to the USC Centre of Public Diplomacy for hosting this event. And thank you to our panelists, Erin and Janis, for joining us today on what is a fascinating topic. So, as Stacey mentioned, among other things in my sports consultancy role, I'm leading a project at sportsdiplomacy.org looking at the need for a US sports diplomacy strategy. And as we've kind of been talking to stakeholders in the space in the US, one thing that consistently comes up in conversations is the unique role for cities in sports diplomacy. And so in this conversation today, we're looking at this intersection of two things: city diplomacy and sports diplomacy, two ways of approaching diplomacy that are arguably becoming more important than ever, and involve both cities and sports as actors carrying out this international engagement, as well as cities and sports being the vector through which this is all carried out. And on the city front, we have seen increasing activity. We're seeing push, for example, for creating an office of subnational diplomacy within the State Department. On the sports diplomacy front in the US is already a world-leading, having a dedicated sports diplomacy division in the State Department. We're seeing new initiatives such as the NBA looking to launch the Basketball Africa League now in May. And so I go back to the term I used earlier of international engagement, because when talking about sports diplomacy and city diplomacy in the kind of broader sense of the term, it's not just about diplomatic relations, it's the full spectrum of international engagement. It is trade, it is national security, it is sports for development. Just 2 days ago was International Day of Sports for Development and Peace. And so it is all of that, as well as the traditional bilateral engagement. And this is a bit the framework for the conversation that we're having today, to explore why sports is such a unique tool for cities looking to expand their diplomatic and international footprint, and talk a bit about how that can be achieved. So I'll now introduce our panelists for today and start with Erin Bromaghim. And Erin serves as Director of Olympic and Paralympic Development in the Office of the Mayor of Los Angeles. And in this role, she focused on realizing the city's plans to make Los Angeles more sustainable, inclusive, resilient, and innovative as the city prepares to host the Olympic and Paralympic Games in 2028. This legacy includes her work at the Conrad and Hilton Foundation Fellow, through which she uses the framework of the UN Agenda 2030 to align, measure, track the city's progress towards the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So, Erin, thank you for joining us today. LA is a city with a huge sporting identity, so many globally renowned sports teams, and a rich Olympic history. So how is the city looking to prepare for the 2028 Olympics? How is sports going to be an important tool for this amazing diplomatic opportunity that the game presents?
Well, thanks, Ed. I appreciate you inviting me to join you today, and thank you to my good friends, including Stacey at the USC Center for Public Diplomacy, for hosting on this event. And as you mentioned, LA is a sports town. We love our teams, we love our champions, we love the Olympic and Paralympic Games. LA has bid to host the games more than any other city, 9 official times. And we will host the Summer Olympics in 2028 for the 3rd time, and excitingly, the Paralympic Games for the 1st time. And for me, watching the Olympic torch run past my house in 1984 in Los Angeles is one of my earliest memories. And so I recognize I have this very unique position in my hometown to do this work of thinking with the most lead time that a city has ever had to prepare for the games. So I know and recognize that this is a very special place to be, and something that you don't get to do necessarily twice. So I'm very, very excited about the work that we have in front of us. But to level set a little bit as some background, Mayor Garcetti established an Office of International Affairs in September of 2017, which happened to coincide with the IOC's award of the Games, the 2028 Games, to Los Angeles. And I was fortunate enough to join the team just a few months after that. As you can imagine, there really wasn't a director for Olympic and Paralympic development before then. But I wasn't stepping into a void. There was a whole team of people who had worked tirelessly, including the mayor, to bring the games back to Los Angeles, going back to 2014 and earlier, through the exploratory and candidature phases of the bid process. And fortunately, many of them are still involved as part of the organizing committee for the Olympic and Paralympic Games in Los Angeles, the private nonprofit that we know as LA 28. And I share this to level set a bit because LA's approach to hosting the games and LA's approach to city diplomacy might be a little bit different from other global cities. In many ways, the chief among them in terms of the difference is that LA28 is a separate entity, and they're responsible for the operations and delivery of the games. And in the United States, we also don't have, as you mentioned, a Ministry of Sport or a Secretary of Sport. We do that through our State Department and their sports diplomacy unit. But all that comes to bear in the fact that in LA, we don't rely on public funds to deliver this or to deliver other major sporting events. And so I believe that approach has made LA a more innovative host city, both in the past and as we look ahead to 2028. And the mayor has often said that Los Angeles is a games changer for the Olympic movement. And we can see that when we look back at the innovations through 1932 and 1984. And our approach to 2028 will be a games changer too. With no new permanent venues, we're really taking the approach that we have to fit the games to the city rather than the city to the games. And so I could go on and on about those particular things, but I think what's important to note in this context is that the diplomatic opportunity that sporting events, particularly events like the Olympic and Paralympic Games, which arguably the biggest in the world, the opportunity that they offer is the chance to share our city and share our values and share our stories in the process of welcoming the world to Los Angeles. And it's a chance for Los Angeles to then also shape these shared experiences, really bring kind of our stamp to kind of this collective global experience of something like the Olympiads. And so I think when we think about the diplomatic opportunities, that becomes the platform, is how do we showcase, how do we share, how do we engage on how we approach the games, how we build a legacy. And that's really what the diplomacy part is all about, is how do we root our engagement with the world around these very practical conversations about the type of events we want to host, how we want to approach that, and the types of benefits that we want to see for our community. So I'll stop there.
All right, thank you a lot, Erin. So over to our next panelist is Janis Burke, and Janis Burke has been the CEO of Harris County Houston Sports Authority since 2006. She became the third chief executive and first woman to hold the position since the inception of the organization in 1997. In addition to overseeing the $1 billion of bond debt service for Houston's professional sports stadiums, under her leadership, Houston has been awarded major sporting events to include the US Olympic trials, collegiate tournaments, numerous national and world championships, and more recently, the Transplant Games of America. In addition to sitting on the board of directors for the National Association of Sports Commissions, Janis has also been recognized locally by Conference USA and Rice University for her outstanding contributions and achievements as a woman in the Houston sports industry. Identified by Texas Executive Women's Association as a woman on the move, and recently named one of Houston's 50 most influential women. So Janis, delighted to have you joining us today, and what a CV. So tell us a little bit more about the work that you do in bringing international sporting events to Houston, the importance of these events to the city, and in particular, given the topic of today's conversation, it would be wonderful to hear more about the World Table Tennis Championships being hosted in Houston and the opportunity that presents for Houston to celebrate perhaps the most famous example of sports diplomacy, the ping pong diplomacy 50 years ago. So yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thanks, Ed. It's great to be here with you, and what a great topic. I think it's really relevant right now. Let me just tell you a little bit about Houston, and that will help play into why our organization thinks these international events are so important. Houston's one of the most international cities. Part of that is probably because of the energy capital of the world status that we hold, and we have a lot of people coming into town from different backgrounds. We speak 145 languages here, and we have over 90 consul offices or representatives from other nations. So it's part of the fabric of who we are as a city. We have one of the largest medical centers in the world, so people fly in from all over the world for medical treatment. Our port is one of the largest, our airport system. So for that reason, our organization, which is a government organization, representing both the city of Houston and Harris County, the city being the third largest in America and the county, the city being the fourth largest and the county being the third largest. It plays very well for us and for our citizens. So because we have all of these citizens from all over the world or transplants that come to live here, they love many different kinds of sports. And so we find that whether we are bidding for cricket, for example, and we hosted that in our baseball stadium, we had to modify the baseball stadium because of course it's not a cricket field. And we did sort of an all-star game, but we had 45,000 attendees show up. And so that got everyone's attention, and now we're looking to build a cricket field. When we were building our rugby stadium, it was actually a soccer stadium. We now call it a rugby stadium because we do so much rugby there. But we made sure that when we were building that soccer stadium, that we built it large enough that we could have enough runoff room to do international rugby. And back when we built that, rugby wasn't very popular in the United States, and not very many cities were bidding on it. And lo and behold, after 2 weeks after we cut the ribbon on that stadium, we were able to host Italy for the first time and had 17,500 people show up, and nobody could believe it. They thought, what is this? What is this rugby? And I don't understand the rules. And so years later now, we have gone and built a rugby stadium that is a standalone rugby stadium, and we still do big international matches at our soccer stadium. So it started with really a necessity for our citizens to make sure that we were bidding for events that they would like and that we were reaching all aspects of our community. But it kind of has turned into more than that. So through the events that we bring in, we can address social issues, for instance. We can address inequality issues, human trafficking, which we are addressing right now with our World Cup bid. FIFA will be making that decision later this year. There are 17 USA cities still in the running, and they have to pare it down to 10. And so we are using this big sporting event to tackle other issues within our community. So that's why it's so important to us. So yeah, let's talk about table tennis. That's an interesting one. The USOPC called me and said, hey, we would love to bid. It's the 50-year anniversary of ping pong diplomacy. We think there's no better city to do it than Houston. We've done a lot of world championship events, and so they knew we could handle it. And and then USA Table Tennis called and said, yes, we're all in. We'd love to support you to go out and bid for it. And so table tennis isn't a huge sport in the United States. The World Championships have never been held here. They've never been really held outside of Asia or Europe. And so it was a lot for me to learn and get my arms around. Here it is, one of China's, it is the biggest sport in China, and the Asian community loves it. And so I knew our Asian community here would really get behind it, but I had to learn a lot about that sport in order to go bid for it. And so what we did is we actually used ping pong diplomacy in our bid. And we reached out to China and we said, hey, it's never been done before, but we heard you're going to bid. What if we bid on the front end of the 50-year anniversary of ping pong diplomacy, and you bid on the back end, and let's do a reception together. So we went to Budapest and we held a reception. Here's China and the United States doing this hospitality event together, which I think sent ripples throughout the whole sporting, that sporting industry. And we invited some of the original team members that were part of ping pong diplomacy. I reached out to the grandson of Richard Nixon and President Nixon's grandson, and said, would you be willing to come? This is a great legacy of your grandfather's. We think it would be wonderful for you to be part of our presenting team. And he said, I would love to. So he hopped on a plane and joined us. And it really just became this wonderful example of how sports touches more than just putting on a great event in a competition, that it can go deeper than that. And so at the very last day we presented, and here we go up first, and then and on the sidelines, the Chinese delegation was rooting for us and cheering. And then we were doing the same for them. And when they announced that we had won 2021 and that they had won 2022, we just automatically, as friends, embraced and were high-fiving and just celebrating. And there were photographers that caught that picture, and it made it all over China, I hear, in their newspapers. So really a wonderful example of how diplomacy can be used in sporting events.
Yeah, thank you, and that is really fascinating. Such a nice story to hear in what arguably is kind of the most famous example of US sports diplomacy, at least. And so glad to see kind of the impact of that going through. And so I guess to kind of kick off the discussion section here, and what I want to do is to take a step back and think and ask why sports, in terms of all the different kind of engagement and diplomatic engagement, international engagement that cities are doing, what is it about sports that helps be the focal point, and what is it that's unique about sports, and that means that we should encourage kind of other cities, other actors to perhaps carry out more sports diplomacy?
I think, Erin, did you want me to go first, or? Okay. I think from my perspective, sports is an even playing field. It doesn't matter what your religious background or what your cultural differences or the color of your skin. When you get on that playing field and you're with your teammates, you know, you're working for one common goal, and it breaks down a lot of barriers. And so we use sports to reach our children and a lot of the youth here in Houston. I'll give you another example. We had an area where there's a lot of underserved youth, and it's not a thriving area by any means. There was some vacant land that our city owned, and they said, hey, Janis, what do you think we could do with this? Do you think there's a way that we could change the perception of that area through sports? Is there a way that we could reach the underserved kids of that area? And I said, yeah, I think it would be great if we kind of made that corner of town more of the extreme sports. And so we built the world's largest skate park, and it's been fabulously successful. And then right next door, we built the world's largest BMX park and bike park. And so we went right away and we bid for the world championships and the national championships of those sports, and we started to bring them to town. But we realized that all of the kids in that area that could walk to that facility or use that facility might not be able to have access to funds to buy a bike. Many of them, we learned, didn't even know how to ride a bike. And when we started to realize this, we didn't want them on the outside of the fence looking in. And so we worked with Rockstar Energy Drink. They named the park. They bought us a trailer. We took 50 bikes. We'd go into all of the schools, and during the PE classes, we would teach kids. We'd first put them on striders without pedals and teach them how to ride bikes. We thought we were going to be dealing with first and second graders that didn't know how to ride bikes. And in that area, we found there were fourth and fifth graders that didn't. And so we had to buy bigger bikes, and we bought them helmets, and we taught them how to ride. And then we developed a STEM program where we'd bring kids out to the park. They could tour the facility. They could learn about BMX and biking and learn about the healthy side of exercising. And then we went back and we had little packets that we would give them, and they would build their own track, BMX track. And there's a lot of mathematics involved because they had to build it to scale. And the teachers just loved it. It became this really big social media buzz about teachers saying, finally, we have real life examples to teach our kids material that we would have to teach them and they'd be tested on anyway at this grade level. So it became something much bigger than just putting on a sporting event or bidding for sports. And those bikes are also left at the facility so that any kids that can walk to the facility, almost like going to a library, where you have a library card and you can check it out. You can check the book out. We did the same thing with bikes. And so kids can go and they can check out a bike and a helmet, and they can ride and then turn it back in before they leave the park. So that's just one example. We do that with every sporting event that we work on.
Yeah, that's great. And it's that reach really that sport has that other doesn't. Erin, anything to add on that front about kind of what is it that sport kind of brings in, and what is it about it unique in terms of how cities can conduct their diplomacy and international engagement?
Sure. So, I mean, I think everything Janis said is spot on, and we have some examples that I can share too from Los Angeles of kind of play equity and the emphasis on ensuring that we can bring sport to everyone and have everyone participate. And I think that goes to the heart of the question, which is, I think it's because sports are pretty universal. Everyone has kind of an understanding of what they are, how they reach. You have your favorite teams, you have your kind of sports identities. And so I think that that becomes something that's really accessible as long as we can kind of build the infrastructure to support that accessibility as well. So I'd say that, but I'd also say that I think it's effective because sports are about partnerships, they're about teams, they're about collective engagement, right? And so when we think about how we approach sports diplomacy at the city level, whether it's through kind of the bid process or trying to attract major events, or it's with engagement in our own communities, using those events as kind of the umbrellas or the, kind of the outreach programs associated with them, it's about building these partnerships within our communities and then with partners overseas, with federations and sport teams. Fundamentally, sports is a combination of kind of all of the different sectors in our society, right? Nonprofit, private, public. And so being able to use sport really as the tool to build those cross-sector and multi-sector partnerships, I think is a really effective means of and a jumping off point for greater diplomatic engagement, right? So I think that that's part of why it makes sense fundamentally.
And on that, kind of one of the topics that I wanted to kind of touch on today was around the different models for how, kind of off the back of that, of how cities can carry out sports diplomacy. What is the best way for them to do it? And for that, it is a shame that in the end Atlanta couldn't join us, and Vanessa couldn't join us today, because in a way they have kind of been pioneers in terms of one of the first cities in the US to kind of explicitly take on this strategic approach to sports diplomacy and calling it as such. And so I wanted to give a brief overview of that as well to for our audiences who might not be able to who haven't been able to hear that from Vanessa. And they created the Global Sports Initiative, kind of looking to elevate the city of Atlanta to this international sports hub, and through different channels, whether it's community engagement, sports exchanges, economic development, and kind of the sports diplomacy at a consular level. And what's really interesting from this here is that they decided to use sports diplomacy as a lens for all of this different international engagement, because, as you say, it is something so universal that they found that sports is a hook that really works in all of these different sectors. And so kind of off the back of that, I wanted to hear your thoughts around what the best model for cities to carry out sports diplomacy is, and kind of from the different models that you're working in with your cities, with your sports authority, is in what is the most effective part of that, what works the best from it, and then kind of the second part to the question is what additional engagement could be helpful, whether from all those different partners that you were talking about, Erin, from sports, from other levels of government, from athletes themselves, perhaps. So yeah, the two parts of the question there. What works well from those models? What can other cities learn from the models that you use to carry out sports diplomacy, and what help or additional engagement could come from that? Also be additional to that, Janis?
Yeah, I think, gosh, there's a lot to that question, or both those questions. I look at our medical community, for instance. They came to me, this is the business community, right, trying to connect with the world. And they said, there's this transplant games. Would you help us bid? You know how to put on events. You do Final Fours and Super Bowls and all these big events. And I had no idea. I didn't even know what the transplant games were. And here we have the world's largest medical center. We're this big Texas state in the United States. And yet we were second to last on the donor registry list of people that have signed up to donate organs if they pass away. And so through this games and through this sport, I learned all about the medical side of things. And one of the doctors asked me to scrub up and come and and watch a surgery. And this was back in 2014, and I've just stayed involved in that community to the point that now we went after a world event, and we're going to be hosting the World Transplant Games. Well, we were until COVID hit. Now we're doing it virtually. But what I learned is we can use this event, and we could get, I was just on the phone with Oregon, India, for instance, or we can get South America cities involved in this virtual event, but we can also connect them, their doctors, with our doctors to learn from each other about what technology we're using, what techniques to save lives. We can push the message forward that signing up on a donor registry, no matter where you're from, is important, that one life can save 7 people's lives. And so I think, or one donor, I should say. So I think that in every event, it's going to be different. What's the outcomes? What are the goals? And how are you going to affect your community or have those diplomatic relationships? So I have friends now in India. I've been on the phone with them at the wee hours of the morning because they're so excited that we're putting on this virtual event because we had to cancel due to COVID. But we've made these connections like that all over the world, and we're learning from each other. And it started with a sporting event.
Great. And on that,
sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, just to kind of follow up on that, and on the kind of what additional help there could be from those other actors, from those different partners that Erin was talking about, whether it's athletes or sports teams and leagues. What more could those different actors be doing to help the cities conduct sports diplomacy?
Yeah, on the athlete side, because we have so many athletes that have international backgrounds, we call on them all the time to help. So we have all of these professional sports athletes that help on our youth events. We ask the athletes to get involved. The Houston Rockets will be involved in our virtual event. NASA is involved in our virtual Transplant Games event because they're super interested in doing STEM and cell research in space. They're someday hoping to grow organs in space and see if that is really successful. And so they're really interested in this. But through it, you create all of these partnerships. So it's not just athletes, it's lots of different people in your community and your business community that you can pull in depending on what the event is. And so our professional athletes help all the time. We created a sports awards program here. All of the team owners, the team presidents, the athletes themselves, they come. It's like a Grammys or an ESPYs awards with red carpet. But through that event, we had some of our most famous quarterbacks say, you know what, let's use the money and the proceeds to give back and do a scholarship program. So our athletes get involved in all of our events.
Thank you. Sorry, Erin, for interrupting you.
No, it's fine. I was going to kind of take it up just a level and go back to kind of the original part of that question, which is that I think we're still, and obviously I'm coming from an office of international affairs within the mayor's office within the city. And so what is the structure for city diplomacy in the United States? You know, this is still a relatively new concept, whereas our colleagues in Europe and Asia, Africa, and parts of Latin America have been really deeply engaged in city-to-city, city bilateral, and city multilateral diplomacy for decades. And so I think this is still kind of a new space for a lot of American cities. So much of our city diplomacy is bilateral or then multilateral through city networks or under the auspices of the multilateral system. And our sports diplomacy is similar. And we have really strong relationships with the other Olympic host cities, particularly Paris, but also Tokyo, Milan, Cortina. And those relationships are much broader than just our focus on kind of hosting in the games, but that gives us, again, like another channel for cooperation and collaboration and exchange. And it does get really practical, oriented in the technical exchanges, as well as the aspirational ones around what we'd like to see out of the games and out of the legacy associated with that. So I think sports diplomacy at the city level, and this is not necessarily informed by Atlanta's strategy, but my own opinions, is really along these kind of three vectors. How do you bid for and use major events to connect globally? And I would be remiss not to mention that LA has a strong history of nonprofit organizations that have been involved in that process, much like the Houston Sports Authority. We have our LA Sports and Entertainment Commission, Los Angeles Sports Council, the Southern California Committee on the Olympic Games. These organizations are private citizens who have been motivated to be involved and help engage with the bidding efforts and trying to bring major events and events like the Games to Los Angeles. I think a second factor is how a city can work with its professional teams as well as its venues and venue owners in terms of engaging, so that when those teams work, professional teams or amateur teams collaborate over, across borders, like the city can be a part of that, can engage with that, can welcome that, and really help kind of showcase what the city'd like to see happen with respect to some of those big events. And then I think a third is how the city can engage in dialogue and exchange around sports to advance its values and priorities. And I think that's a lot of what Janis is talking about. This isn't just sports marketing, it's really how do you use the engagement, the universality of sport, and the reality of having kind of the ability for play and recreation to actually bring benefits back into the community. So how do we channel the energy that is, what makes LA competitive as a sports capital of the world? How do we channel that back into issues of kind of equity in our community and play equity, but also economic development opportunities, and really bring benefits both to kind of our industries, our creative industries, to sustainable infrastructure and planning, as well as direct community and benefit to residents. So I think there's a lot of opportunity along those different kind of channels, and that's where I think it's particularly effective.
Yeah, and I would just add, because Erin, that's a really good point at a higher level. I remember when we were doing the weightlifting world championships, and there's a lot of countries where weightlifting is super popular that are tough countries for us to get into the United States. And so when we were bidding, they were saying, how can you assure us that you're going to get all of our people in, if they're coming from Iraq, Iran, Russia, Syria, some of these where there could be tension between the two countries. And so it gave us a really good opportunity to work with our State Department, because that's the last thing we wanted as a host city, was for somebody to not be able to get into the last qualifying event before the Olympic Games and not be able to make their Olympic dream because they couldn't get in. And I was really proud because people were very worried about that. It hadn't been in the United States in over 40 years, so many of these countries weren't familiar with us. And I'm super proud that we got every single athlete in from every country. We had 110 countries, and it was one of their largest world championships ever. So I think, to Erin's point, sometimes even in the subtle ways of saying, no, this goes way beyond political views, we can break down barriers and we can work together, and our country's State Department can work with your country's State Department to make sure that we are able to get these athletes here.
Yeah, and that's all really fascinating. And I mean, we've talked a lot about opportunity, but there are also some risks of kind of using sports as that focal point for diplomacy. And Janis, I mean, we mentioned China before in relationship with the bids for table tennis, but also, Houston has had its challenges with China recently in terms of the episode of the Houston Rockets and comments on Hong Kong. So if you could kind of give us some insight into what it was like dealing with the repercussions from that, and how that affected the kind of sporting landscape, the relationship with China, and how, even with this event, with the World Table Tennis Championships happening this year, and how you kind of managed to work around that and with that to kind of solve and address some of those challenges.
Yeah, it's a really good question, because it can go either way, right? When you're in this sports world and you're working with other countries. And in China, there are 500 million Chinese fans that watch NBA games. It's huge. And we, according to studies, Rockets were the second most popular team in China. Part of that is, of course, we had Yao Ming, who's now head of the Chinese Basketball Association. And we just had built that relationship over the years. And here, a text from, or a tweet out, I'm sorry, not a text, a tweet out from the Rockets general manager, Daryl Morey, found himself in this controversy that I don't think he even ever expected. He thought he was, oh, I have some friends in Hong Kong and I'm going to just put my personal opinions out there, and realize that his 6-word post literally threw the NBA and the Rockets team, our ownership, the entire team into some challenging times. And so I really could appreciate what the NBA commissioner said. He came out and basically said it's regrettable. At the same time, we acknowledge that we allow our players to have the right to freedom of speech, but it is regrettable because we've built these relationships over the years, and we hope that we can use sports to once again unify us. And it was a whole year that there were not NBA games, but it wasn't until the finals, NBA finals game 5 and 6, that it was aired again in China. So there was a lot of damage. So you're right, it can go to the opposite side. And hopefully we're working through that. Daryl is not here in Houston anymore. He's moved to the Philadelphia team, but I think he even himself learned, I only knew one side of an issue, and there's this whole other world and a whole other side, and that my words do matter, very powerfully, a very powerfully learned lesson there.
Yeah, and Erin, on the topic of kind of Olympics, we've seen in the news the last couple of days kind of comments around whether the US State Department was going to be boycotting or talking about boycotting the Beijing Winter Olympic Games, which they've since sort of come out saying that that's not the case. But how does the issue of boycotts come into your work when managing the kind of diplomacy front, and how do you try and kind of preserve the sporting integrity of the Olympics? What are the kind of thought process, the plans, the diplomatic engagements to avoid what no one really wants to see, the boycotts? You want to be seeing the sporting product, but often sports is a tool and kind of the platform for a lot of this this political these political issues.
Yes, it is somewhat inevitable that there will be political dynamics of what is largely an apolitical event, right, in the games. I think, with respect to potential boycott, like that is the decision that the federal government will make. And, I trust that they will take the steps to think through kind of all of their options with respect to how to meaningfully engage in the space around kind of human rights and the Chinese government and what they are focused on with respect to the conversation around a boycott, right? So what options are there to really, I think, meaningfully make a statement, right, that doesn't disproportionately and negatively impact our athletes, right, who are the ones that would bear kind of the greatest burden of a boycott or a lack of participation by the United States. So I think at the city level, that's not necessarily something that we're directly involved in. That's the federal government decision. I think we have our own relationship directly with other cities, with host cities, with the international federations and with the IOC and others. And, so we stay closely engaged in thinking through what we as a host city want to ensure we achieve with the games. And likewise, other major events. And Janis mentioned both Los Angeles and Houston are in the running as potential host cities for games in the 2026 FIFA World Cup. We find out later this year if we will host a specific game, but we, as part of that process, have been deeply engaged with FIFA in the development of human rights related strategies, looking specifically at human rights related risk areas, issues like trafficking and labor abuses, and how do we plan at this point really to ensure that we have the frameworks, both legal and responsive, and all that goes into it to protect against any sort of human rights related abuses. And to her point too, that has brought us into, again, another kind of set of multi-sector, multi-stakeholder partnerships to really confer with everyone from labor unions and representatives to the professional teams to really better understand how we can protect against any sort of human rights abuses. And so I think all of this presents a tremendous opportunity for us to engage at the city level in some of these really reflective and planning based, and thinking about how we center our values in the approach that we take to planning and delivering these major events.
Great, thank you. Well, we've been getting some questions in from the audience, so I'll turn to some of those. And kind of off the bat, talking about human rights and talking about the kind of values of sports, we've had a question from the audience that is sort of saying how cities that are looking to project this kind of progressive identity or project the kind of positive social impact of sports with some of those values around kind of equality, teamwork, and how can cities address the more divisive aspects of those within sport? Because there are issues around whether it's class, race, gender, ability within sports, and so how do cities find that balance between kind of promoting the positive aspects of these sporting events on those issues, whilst also kind of addressing and being aware that it's still not perfect within those sports?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I think obviously, the more that I'm in this business, the more I realize, especially when you want to do host international events, that there are cultural differences. There's difference in thought process. There's difference how we contract things. American contracts can be overly complex to some of those that others from around the world. So I think I've learned a lot by not having all the answers, to be honest, and just sitting down with other partners from around the globe and saying, well, how did you do this, or how did you handle it? And so all these complex issues, I think, comes down to working together with the common goal of putting on the best events we can for the athletes.
And I think for us, really, it becomes about centering these values in the approach. So I think I've mentioned this, but when we think about the supply chain to support a major event, how are we ensuring that underrepresented businesses can be a part and have access to those opportunities? How do we build procurement channels that really draw in the whole of our community and provide kind of new opportunities for underrepresented and traditionally marginalized communities? And I think that, procurement, local hire, those are two particular areas where sporting events provide their own set of opportunities that are really exciting and can be a launching pad for our small businesses in this community. And I think that that's true not just in the kind of economic development set, but also in some of these other opportunities we've talked about. So, Los Angeles had an opportunity that was unique in this dual award that happened with LA and Paris with respect to the 2024 and 2028 Olympic and Paralympic Games. And as a result of moving to the 2028 set, the mayor spoke to the IOC and said, I cannot wait till 2029 to ask Angelenos to really see some direct benefit from hosting. We can't hope and pray that in 2029 there'll be a legacy the way that there was in 1984. We really need to see some kind of benefit come to the community up front. And so he worked closely with LA28 and the IOC, and over the last couple of years, we now have put together what is a $160 million investment in youth sports programming through the city of Los Angeles and our Department of Recreation and Parks to ensure that any kid in the greater LA area, in our city, right, can participate in youth sports programming and fitness classes at low or no cost, really. So blowing open this opportunity to participate in sport. And particularly thinking about that with a lens on gender and gender equity, we had previously seen that for families that were struggling to meet the cost of participating in sport, there tended to be sometimes a preference to let the boys play and not necessarily the girls. And there's also a bunch of research that shows that girls tend to drop out of sport for various reasons. There's a real drop off in that middle school age bracket of 12, 13 years old. But there are tactics and there are strategies that you can use to keep girls engaged in sport and healthy lifestyles. And that involves using having active mentors, seeing women reflected in the leadership roles as coaches and officials, keeping girls together in cohorts that last year over year, as opposed to kind of standing up and shutting down teams like, season after season. And so using some of those strategies, our Department of Rec and Parks really focused in on a program that we call Girls Play LA, which over the course of just a couple of years had a tremendous impact in the number of girls participating in our Rec and Parks programming. I think from something like 25, 26% up to 43, 45% of the overall youth participation or youth population participating in sport. And so I think looking at how we center those values again in how we do business around sports and how we bring those values then and use those examples in our dialogues with partners globally, with other cities around the world, with other leagues and federations, and how we establish that those expectations will be, that those values will be a part of how we do business, how we produce these events, how we go out to bid, how we participate in this with our community. I think that that's really key, and that's what, that is how we kind of walk the walk, right? Live the work.
Yeah, same here. In the gender equality or even environmental issues, how are we putting these events on, and are we throwing a lot of plastic away, or are we recycling? I mean, from every aspect of the event, bringing those vendors together and those partners, I think, to Erin's point, is how we're tackling
it. Yeah, and I think it's what Erin's point about having such a big lead up time is, it kind of taps in a bit to answer this question around, right? It's not just an event where you are just showcasing one thing here and saying everything is great. You have that whole piece beforehand of looking for ways to talk about these values, for ways to make things better before that event as well within the sporting communities, and then to go on beyond that on legacy, which ties into another of the questions here from the audience, and there's a question coming from Brazil. And seeing that they kind of saw with the Olympics and the World Cup, there was huge visibility to the country and positive impact in the short term. But the member of the audience here was saying that the legacy for underserved communities wasn't very sustainable. And so, what are those essential aspects to build a strategic and sustainable legacy with these global sporting events, whether it's Olympics or other events? And so, I guess that kind of leads neatly into that bit around, how do we make these sustainable?
Yeah, and I think legacy is a big part of every event, no matter how big or small. It's super important. It's part of our goals that we set out right from the very beginning, right from the bid stage. Well, what do we want to get out of this? What does it mean to our community? So I think setting those goals and speaking them into existence and letting the community know so they hold you accountable. But I know when we hosted Copa America here in Houston, we used the proceeds of the event to add green space. We have on the east part of town many Hispanic children that wanted to play soccer, but there wasn't enough green space in their part of town, and they weren't lit fields and they weren't gated and safe. And so we used the proceeds from that event and put them into building a field for them. And we're not in the business of maintaining a field. So we worked with Parks and Rec Department in our city, department of our city, to maintain it going forward. And we worked with an after-school program to program it, to make sure that the kids were getting the programming and that it was fair for everybody, fair access. So I think you have to set the goals up from the beginning, and then you have to hold the community responsible, and together you do it and you make it happen if you've set out that that is a goal.
I would add to that too. I think it starts with like taking some of the risk off the table from the get-go, right? So I think there's been a tradition in the past to look at these major events as kind of redevelopment projects and game changers for the city as a whole, right? Like we're going to dramatically redo something or do something differently because of an event. And I think instead with 2028 in particular, we're thinking about it as a time horizon, right? What can the city do that we've already started, that we have investment in, that we'd like to see happen? How can we accelerate some of those goals and those projects so that we can deliver by 2028, but we're not doing things for the games. We're not building huge new stadiums. We're not creating huge new public infrastructure projects. We're not, reclaiming land or doing anything to create permanent venues. This is really about how do we use the amazing world-class infrastructure that we already have, particularly when we look at our sporting venues. And we have such an embarrassment of riches in that regard, from new SoFi Stadium in Inglewood all the way to Rose Bowl and the Memorial Coliseum, which is built in 1923 and will host the Olympic Games. Will be the first venue to ever host 3 opening ceremonies. I mean, it's an amazing space. And we have this huge wealth of infrastructure already in Los Angeles. And so our focus now is how do we make it more sustainable? How do we improve the transit in between? How do we make it more walkable? So it's not dramatically, creating these stadiums out of nowhere. This is about working with what we have and understanding how to connect it better, and how we can use that planning horizon of what we now have 7.5 years before the Olympic and Paralympic Games to really think about making the city more livable, more sustainable, more approachable for those visiting from out of town, as well as those who live here.
And I think using the bid process too, whether you win the bid or not. So we are working with our arts community who, because of COVID, they haven't really been able to work much, and they're desperate to be put to work. So we paired them with our corporate community, and we're doing what we're called the Art of Soccer. And they're ceramic balls, soccer balls, all over the city that corporations are buying, and then they're employing artists to work. So it's a really good community effort, so that again we can put excitement around just the bid process, and we haven't even won it yet. So that's still bringing the community together, and I think that's it's a really good way to do it too. And we build, our organization owns the professional sports stadiums in Houston, so we have 4 of them. And I would say it's not an overnight snap your fingers and you're all of a sudden you see this change. But when we first built our Major League Baseball stadium, that was the first one we built, it was not in a great part of downtown, but it was built there on purpose to try to help turn and be a catalyst for rebirth in the downtown area. And it was put there on purpose, and it is now a beautiful part of the downtown, but it didn't happen overnight. That stadium is now 20 years old.
Well, we have a question following on similar theme around making sure that you get value from sports diplomacy and from whether it's from events or whatever, and it's from a public diplomacy student and around sports diplomacy evaluation, and how in the context of public diplomacy evaluation, how do you evaluate sports diplomacy programs that you have conducted, and what evaluation methods do you value, do you use, and how do you ensure that you can kind of measure, assess the benefits of these sports diplomacy programs? And that's, I know, a tricky question, but
we have had sister city programs grow out of our diplomacy efforts around international events. We have had exchange programs. We have had athletes come and train here through the relationships that have been built. So some of it's very organic, and then some of it is just very goal oriented and having enough years to plan and to make sure you execute and you have those measurements put in place.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I think, it goes to the heart of how do you measure the impact of diplomacy overall, right? And I think a big part of that is that diplomacy, I believe, is really about creating these channels, right? Being able to know who to call, have the relationships, have some level of trust built up so that you can reach out, you can exchange, you can share best practices, you can, give voice to dissent. Like there are different things that that diplomacy helps facilitate, and that's what we try to achieve with sports diplomacy as well. I think there are a number of places where there's an opportunity to improve evaluation or to add to kind of the overall core of knowledge in this space, right? Which is still very much like an emerging space. Like this feels very much like talking about sports diplomacy and intersection with city diplomacy is a little bit vanguard. Though it's been happening for years, it doesn't necessarily have kind of an established framework or structure. And so, one thing is I hold these two roles, right, that are unified, right, which is how we're thinking about the Paralympic and Olympic development that we need to do ahead of 2028, how we want to use this to bring a positive legacy to all Angelenos. And then how do we use the Sustainable Development Goals and the UN's Agenda 2030 to think about kind of that as a framework. So for those who aren't familiar with the SDGs, there are 17 big kind of aspirational goals that range from no poverty to peace and justice, economic development, quality education for all. These are a shared development agenda for all nations in the globe. All member states of the UN unanimously adopted this. And so that gives us this really big set of broad-based goals by which we can start thinking about how those things intersect with the work that we do at the local level and the work that we do in partnership with cities and governments internationally. And so I'd say there's space. I mentioned there's space. So, SDGs are just one framework that you could potentially use. And we measure ourselves in Los Angeles against the SDGs. We report on more than 150 different data-driven indicators evaluating our progress toward the goals. But I think we also, in terms of kind of that diplomatic space creation, right? We have these bilateral, we have these multilateral relationships. And I think we also have the opportunity to start capturing some of that a little bit more into some sort of knowledge management. So what doesn't really exist, and I don't know if Janis, you agree with me on this or not, but there isn't necessarily like a hub for how host cities do business, right? There's knowledge transfer that professional leagues and the IOC invest in with respect to organizing committees or bid committees or event-driven, there's knowledge transfer that comes from the NFL with Super Bowl, there's knowledge transfer that comes with the IOC to organizing committees. But at the city-to-city level, there isn't necessarily a whole lot of kind of best practices or a shared library or kind of, and some of that I think is rooted in the fact that when we think about it domestically, we're competing against each other, right? We're often, trying to get the same events or trying to draw the same eyes, the same visitors, the same kind of, the same impact. But I think there is a potential to really start building out that type of host city-to-city type collaboration space and really better capture the lessons that we can all benefit from in terms of how we do this more sustainably, how we build a positive legacy for our communities, and then the technical parts of it too, right? How do you do this at scale? How do you do this in a way that really involves the community effectively? And so I think that there's a lot of room there, not just for evaluation, but for that knowledge management and capture.
Yeah, and I think that we have started, in the United States with the association that I chair, trying to bring cities together to talk honestly about the challenges or the some of the things that they need to overcome or the goal setting, or so we can all get better, because iron sharpens iron and we all want to be the best we can be and put on the best events. And so I think, to Erin's point, exchanging that even internationally, not just among us here in America and American cities, but having that exchange with other cities can be really beneficial.
And just one more quick thing to add, I think there is a good example of where I've seen some of that happen, and that's following 2012 and the London Olympic and Paralympic Games. The UK government realized that they had, after 2012, this whole cadre of really talented, tremendously engaged folks who had worked on everything across the entire spectrum of producing this major and very successful world event, right? From transportation to security to public safety and all of the different planning that goes into a game, as well as the legacy and creating greater activity in the, among sports and participation in the community. So all of that talent, rather than just letting it kind of go to the wind, the UK government has really deliberately tried to continue to support that. And they've done it by actually creating government to government agreements with other countries and cities in those countries hosting specific events. So when you look at the Pan American Games in Lima, Peru in 2019, there was a huge investment of support from the UK government to actually bring some of their expertise and talent, much of it in the private sector, but also in partnership with the Department of International Trade, to support Peru and to support the city of Lima as they thought through how to do some of this work. And that leaves behind an amazing amount of kind of official technical assistance, right, that we achieve in a country to country and hopefully in a city to city type of exchange.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they were the kind of one of the main delivery partners in those games, and I think with the combination of some of the biggest sporting events in the world taking place in the US over the coming years, I think that's something to bear in mind at kind of different government levels of what are the expertise that we want to build as either host cities or as the US as a whole, and then that becomes part of that sustainability, that legacy piece, which, as you mentioned, the UK have done there. Another question here from the audience around balancing priorities, and I guess this is where kind of cities are between all the different partnerships and have different demands from the different partners that we were talking about earlier. And so, this question is asking around how can government agencies keep the balance between the demands from the external agents, whether they're your international sports organizations or private sector, with the demands of the kind of the host cities' citizens, which are on usually more socially orientated, and what the balance, I guess, between those.
I'm happy to start off, Janis, if you want. And I just say, I think that there has to be, there's kind of expectation management on both sides. So I think that these events aren't necessarily just like an open piggy bank where we can do all kinds of projects and affiliated projects. I think it always has to be rooted in kind of this shared understanding of actually producing an event, the benefits that will come to the community through the folks who will be part of that event, the spectators, the folks that visit our city, the folks that stay and patronize all the restaurants in the region, patronize all the hotels and all that type of direct tax benefit to the city, but also then in terms of how the community can engage in that event. So that's where, event after event, it's not just about hosting and getting the tax dollars. It has to also be about how the community can be part of that. Are there volunteer programs in place? Are there business, basically business connect like programs like the one that the NFL creates, right, to really draw local businesses into those supply chain opportunities? How are those programs established so that the community can be part of it and see benefit from hosting these major events, but also managing expectations that it's not gonna, they're not a panacea for all things in the city.
Yeah, and I think that balancing is the key. That's the key word. We do have to balance a lot, and when we're looking to bid for an event, we are balancing what does this mean for our community, what kind of tax dollars is it bringing in, but more than that, what kind of legacy is it leaving? I think there's a lot of aspects to it and a lot of thought process, at least from our side, that goes into before we bid for an event. Volunteerism is a big part of it. We had 10,000 volunteers for the Super Bowl. We trained them all. We used our NBA arena to bring them all in and get them excited, and they were our ambassadors. And so I think that also is another aspect of bringing your community into it. You don't want your citizens saying, why are they bidding and bringing these big events? It's just causing me traffic problems and I can't get to work. You want them to be excited and proud. And so to do that, you have to include them and do a lot of outreach. We had about $4 million of contributions that went to different charities through the Super Bowl, hosting it here in Houston. So I think there's lots of ways to accomplish it, but it is a balancing act.
Great. Well, I'm not sure we have time to go through all the different questions. We've had a range of them coming in about marathon, sports diplomacy, around symbols in sports diplomacy, and others. So for those who haven't had a chance to have your questions discussed, we do feel free to reach out to any of us or all of us after the event, and we'd be happy to discuss on those. But just to wrap things up here, I think what has been key and about this discussion is that it is something new. That we are taking two new concepts. Well, I wouldn't say new concepts. So city diplomacy and sports diplomacy has been carried out for a long time, but two concepts that are being adopted strategically more and more, and that element of it is what is recent. And so in this field of sports diplomacy and cities, we are in kind of new territory. And so these platforms and these ways to share the expertise, to share those different models of engagement with kind of hosting and bidding for sporting events, for conducting different sports diplomacy programs, which I know kind of had Vanessa been able to join us today, she would have talked a lot about those too. And so, events like this one today, where we've had people in the audience join, I know from different cities around the US and around the world, and so to keep those conversations going, I think is really important. And along with that will come different things of how to measure the success. A lot of these initiatives are new, and I think that's what we'll be seeing more of, and it's important to be having those conversations. So thank you again for joining us here on this call today. Really fascinating to hear of your insights, and look forward to see later this year how the World Table Tennis Championships go on, and particularly with kind of tension still being in the air around China, and hopefully that's an opportunity to address some of those areas in common, and those kind of diplomatic channels there. But thank you to everyone for joining us today.
Thanks.